I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare Anyone? Hi, listeners. Elyse here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Kourtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Kourtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Kourtney.
Hi, Elyse. How is it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing really well. I am gooped and gagged that we are already talking about revisiting both A Midsummer Night's Dream and Titus Andronicus.
Yeah, that we're at another year-end kind of look back at what we've learned and reprocessing these plays through, the journey we've been on this year. Yeah.
Yeah, it is always shocking to me when we get to this point because time is such a bizarre entity to me, but I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to put these two officially to bed as well for a bit. For me.
I am as well. Yeah, well, for sure you with Midsummer because Midsummer has been your life for a year and a half?
Yeah, I mean, the 6 months that we were working on Titus was the first 6 months in a year and a half where I wasn't working on something to do with Midsummer.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just dive into Midsummer.
Let's start at the very beginning of 2023.
Yeah, Midsummer for me is, I know that play almost word for word at this point in my career. So rereading it is an exercise in patience. I kind of took away one thing. So I'd love to hear what you found again this time around.
Yeah, I actually found that with this reread, I really enjoyed reading Midsummer. And I also kept thinking about how simple Midsummer is and how much people complicate this play in performance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I started thinking a lot about Theseus and Hippolyta and their relationship and how you build their relationship and what makes an interesting and successful pairing versus what's not as successful. Yeah. And I was thinking a lot about the line, Hippolyta, I wooed thee with my sword and won thy love doing thee injuries, but I will wed thee in another way, with pomp, with triumph, and with reveling. And I was thinking about how much of that line makes me think of Brotheus and how fun and party animal, frat guy Theseus maybe should be, because he literally says, I'm going to win you with pomp, with triumph, and with reveling. And how much fun Theseus should be trying to have in this play from top to bottom.
Yes.
And that's something that really stood out because I have a lot of trouble with Hippolyta and Theseus.
Yeah, I think that generally like not enough time is spent on them. Some choices that are made in production kind of make those two characters extra difficult because like we don't have explicit language about how angry and upset is she by the law of Athens or how they reconcile at the end. It all kind of is very simple. And I think that productions, is what I mean when we say we, tend to overcomplicate the relationship here. And they can both be a little, I think, simpler than people make them. And I have thoughts. Means people have heard enough about like my desire for especially Theseus and Hippolyta and the Athenians and the fairies to be funnier. Productions don't for some reason. And this is a comedy. Rereading it, I was like, yeah, this is a comedy.
Where is the comedy?
Where is the How do we make sure there's comedy with these characters?
Yeah.
And how do we like keep that present? How are these scenes funny?
Yeah. One other thing that came up in my reread was really thinking about this ancient privilege of Athens, the law that you had mentioned. And like, I mean, they, for lack of a better word, suck. The options are obey your father and marry Demetrius, die, or go to a nunnery and live a single life. And that question that you mentioned is, how do we continue the comedy throughout this play when like in reality, that's not a kind place for women, but how do we not root it in something that's what the National Theater did?
Yes, exactly. How do we not make, to go back to the quote that you said of like, I wooed thee with my sword and won thy love doing the injury, is very different language. Like, I know we're going to talk about Titus later. In both plays, we have a ruler in Greece and a ruler in Rome who take prisoners of war as their brides. And Hippolyta is depicted very differently at the top of this than Tamara.
And in reality, yes, Hippolyta is a prisoner of war, and I'm not like undercutting what that is. But for a Shakespeare play that's a comedy, looking at the language, I wooed thee with my sword and won thy doing the injuries. That doesn't necessarily translate to what Tamara went through, which was watching her son be sacrificed and there being all this bloodshed around it. And it could also be seen as a good faith wooing of, we're going to have fun. We're going to party.
Yeah. Just because Athens has conquered the Amazons doesn't mean that we are subjugating them to more horrors. And to go back to Tamara, that's done at the hands of the Andronici, not Saturninus.
Yeah.
And her relationship with Saturninus is so very often like coded as romantic and one of equals. And I think that like we try to make Theseus and Hippolyta a little too serious for a comedy.
Yeah. Of course, this is not to dismiss what being a prisoner of war could be, but also this is a Shakespeare comedy.
Right.
Maybe we should lighten up our approach to that relationship versus rooting it in our
modern concepts of what being a prisoner of war is.
Yeah.
Because I think also like it's clear from Shakespeare's plays and what we know about how nobility was treated in the early modern era when they did have conflicts is very different than how modern warfare exists.
Yeah, I think that one thing we could have gone into that we didn't, that would really help to potentially better root this in something that's more palatable and fun for a comedy, is what was being a prisoner of war, what was conflict, military conflict.
I want to say class plays a big role in the experience of war.
Yeah. Maybe exploring that would open doors to approaching this
as a comedy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Again, I can't stress enough, like, this is
not
light. This is just like, we're just looking at like, this is literally a comedy.
I think also what we're saying is the way that Hippolyta is depicted in Act 1, Scene 1 is not as a prisoner of war, as we understand prisoners of war today. And perhaps to portray her as such is making light of the experience of prisoners of war today in modern warfare. And we're just trying to say like, it's not the same thing and we should maybe stop doing that.
Yeah.
So my thing, and it kind of gets to like the lovers should be funny and they should be funny. They should be young. They should be,
naive,
impulsive,
naive and
impulsive and adventurous. One thing I want to see more of in productions is playing with age. I think that this is a show that a lot of times gets very like young, sexy casts because we're dealing with like love and sex.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh man, I'd love to see an Oberon and Titania in their 50s, 60s, because they have all of this language about the length of their relationship and all these things that they've done to each other. Sure, fairies are timeless and they are immortal, but why does that mean that they can't have gray hair and wrinkles?
Mm-hmm. And they say we are the original, the parents.
We are the parents, we are the originals. And that got me thinking about like just age in this play in general. And one thing that I landed on was that I'm really tired of the conceit of double casting Theseus Hippolyta with Oberon Titania and Phil Straight Puck.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like if we let them be separate, we could have a really interesting depiction of relationships and courtship at different ages. So if you had Oberon and Titania in the 50s, 60s, you could have Theseus and Hippolyta be 30s, 40s, and then you have the lovers in their, probably late teens, 20s.
Yeah.
And having them be separate, one of the issues that comes up in production when you have them doubled is if the fairies are funny as an actor to try to like build contrast in Oberon Titania Puck to Theseus Hippolyta Philostrate, the decision is like, well, one is funny
or sexy, and
then the other ones are like buttoned up and serious.
Mm-hmm.
And if we remove that connection, then it frees up Theseus Hippolyta Philostrate to focus on being funny because they don't have to worry about being in direct contrast with these fairy characters that are also funny.
I think that's an interesting point because I noticed in my read that in 3-2, Oberon calls himself a forester. And then in Act 4, Theseus says, go, one of you, find out the forester. And I'm like, that very much is like, go find
the king
Oberon.
Of the forest. Yeah.
So it's very much language that indicates that they're two separate entities.
Yeah. So that was my like one thought was I was just like, oh man, I want to stop seeing that. It's just done so much.
Yeah, that sounds exciting.
So now let's move into our second play of the year that we really did just finish, Titus.
Mm-hmm.
There were just some major things that stood out to me. 1-1 should be engaged with a lot more in educational settings and in spaces where people are studying Shakespeare and Shakespeare in performance, because it is, 1, long. 2, there's so much that happens. I was like, man, like, this would be a great scene study. This one should be done more because there's so many shifts of power and different, motivations and relationships and status. It's
all foundational.
It's so it's such a great foundational like theater scene that I was just like, it's so good. Outside of that, of like, wow, 1-1 was picking up on some things that like I didn't quite pick up on in our read, or like over the course of our working on this play, I kind of like forgot. Rome and the Goths and Titus have been at war for 10 years before the start of this play. And conversely, with Theseus and Hippolyta, where we're like, maybe don't let the war influence it that much. It's like, no, a decade is a really long time to be at war.
Yeah. And with Titus, it's 21 sons by this point have been killed in battle.
Yeah, and Titus has been a soldier for Rome long before that. But this, for 40 years, but this specific war took 10 years. And I just like, that is something that like just didn't land in a lot of ways for me.
Yeah.
I was also like, oh yeah, Bassianus has language about how much he likes Lavinia.
I also picked up on that.
Okay.
You and I, that was the first thing I was going to say, that he tells us early on he thinks she's cute.
That she's
a rich ornament.
Yeah, that she's the cutest thing in all of Rome. And I was like, oh, I think both productions that we watched cut that line. I was like, oh, yeah, he likes her. It's not just like, surprise, I'm taking her.
And then that can inform that one scene that always throws me for a loop, which is when Bassianus and then Titus's sons
Yes.
take Lavinia away, and it feels very unclear, not rooted in a reality.
That scene that's part of 1-1. Yeah, is that like, oh, Bassianus and these sons know how much Bassianus and Lavinia love each other. And maybe Titus is the one who's out of the loop here. Or Titus is trying so hard to align with Saturninus because he thinks that Saturninus should be emperor for some reason.
Yeah.
It also surprised me that Demetrius is the first Goth to speak of revenge.
I also wrote that down.
Okay. I also picked up on, and this is, coming out of our conversations with Carson and Mia, but I picked up on that the first, guest, Saturninus says that Lavinia is his guest.
And
I was like, oh, that's interesting.
I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, it's actually the only use of the word guest in the entire play. Saturninus, at the end of 1-1, he says, Lavinia, though you left me like a churl, I found a friend, and sure as death I swore I would not part a bachelor from the priest. Come, if the emperor's court can feast 2 brides, you are my guest, Lavinia, and your friends. This day shall be a love day, Tamara.
That's such an inversion.
Lavinia is a guest, and Lavinia is who one of the first acts against the Andronici is committed against.
I mean, and Bassianus is only killed so that Demetrius and Chiron can ravish Lavinia.
Yep.
So
yeah, Lavinia and your friends. Aaron also has one of the first instances of sort of racially coded language, which, as we talked about with Mia, these sort of negative connotations to blackness, of to use A Midsummer Night's Dream, who would not exchange a raven for a dove, is a very common
that one popped out to me with Midsummer as well. Yeah.
But Aaron inverts it to me and says that envy is pale and puts a negative connotation on paleness, on whiteness. And that is very interesting, as we've not had anyone actually comment on Aaron's blackness yet.
Those would be really excellent moments to do a close reading of and see what's there. The one other thing that I was really thinking a lot about, and I have been thinking about this since the beginning of Titus, is burial rites and what burial rites are in early modern England and what that meant to the early modern people, because there's such an emphasis on the sons, the burials.
The 3 different.
Yeah, Mucius is not allowed to be buried because he betrayed Titus. And then at the end, Lavinia and Titus get the proper burial. Tamara is left to be feasted on by the birds.
Yeah. And then
Aaron has that reverse lynching that Mia talked about.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking a lot about what is burial rites? What does it mean? What did it look like to the people, to Shakespeare's audience?
Because that is such a key piece, like hospitality in this play. The social implications of burial rites and who gets what is also, I think, a layer that doesn't exactly translate for a modern reader or modern audience as well.
It's much like Ophelia's burial and the Christian burial. And
yeah, that's super fascinating. Well, that is the end of our year with A Midsummer Night's Dream and Titus Andronicus.
I really, at the end of this, I want to wrap up and say, I hope people take all of this work and these thoughts and these questions and examine it further and put on some really good productions that call into question some of these things that we've thought about, that our guests have brought to our attention. I mean, I would love to see more thoroughly examined productions.
Both of these, yeah.
Yeah, not to shame. There were great things from the wrap-ups that we watched, but there's so much more investigating to do.
Yeah. And that's it. That is a really good note to end it on. Thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone.
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, ShakespeareAnyone.com, follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod, or Twitter at ShakespeareAnyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare Any and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Julius Caesar, Act 3, Scene 1. Spoken by Mark Antony. Cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war.